All right, and that acts as a segue to a discussion this morning with our panelists who are already in studio with us. We will take a keener look on what is happening with the state of democracy in East Africa. Allow me to introduce to you this morning Professor George Wajakoya, who's an advocate, George and Lyndon advocates. Also, he is a lecturer at the University of USAU, law faculty. Also, we do have with us Maurice Mashiwa, who is the director of Serrano Africa. We do have with us as well Peter Kagwanja, who is a chief executive officer of Africa Policy Institute. Also is a visiting scholar, Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies, University of Nairobi, and also former government advisor to the president the year 2008-2013. Also, we do have with us as well Martin Olo, who is an advocate of the High Court. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. Right, looking at the state of affairs that we had, and I want just to begin with what we have also on our smart screen. Maybe you can try and weigh in. We begin in Rwanda and what has happened recently, of course, now with that particular opposition leader, that is Diane Rwigara, being charged of insurrection, and also, you know, her mom also being thrown in the slumbers as well by the authorities there. This is what we have on the front page of, actually on the editorial page of the Standard this morning. If we may just drop the strap a bit so that we can see what will be. Let's begin with you, Professor George Wajakoya. Looking at this particular cartoon, what really comes to mind? We have the international community, we have the media, we have the civil society, and we have the opposition being also, you know, thrown into that chana, which is a mincemeat chana.
That is a dictatorship at the middle. Dictatorship at the middle reminds us of what happened in Poland in those dark days. It also reminds us of what happened in Chile, where there was militarism, military dictatorship. And now, this is a replica of what happened during the Cold War, where opposition was regarded and classified on the left side on the right side of the left, or left side of the left. What Kagame is doing now is what he was fighting against, and therefore he has become a typical benevolent dictator like the one we had for 48 years in Singapore. Whatever charges that have been brought here have been brought up by the people appointed by Kagame in his courts, and knowing the fact that Kagame has military background, former director of intelligence in Museveni's government, former guerrilla during that time when they started RPF with the late Fred Rijima, whom I knew personally. The man has just become a benevolent dictator.
Benevolent dictator. Of course, that also has been drawn to the public lexicon very recently by the vice chair of the Jubilee Party as well, saying that yes, maybe we should go the Rwandan way, where we do have a benevolent dictator. I don't know what will be your sentiment. Let's hear from Mashiwa.
Thank you very much. Benevolent dictatorship, if you focus your kaleidoscope, you know, like, you know, Professor says, globally, it never survives long enough. It does not provide the ingredients for majority of people in society to thrive. If East Africa were to full scale pursue that path, pick the case of Kenya, you have an array of institutional arrangements that are pronouncing a direct opposite of possibility of pursuing benevolent dictatorship in this country. So philosophically speaking, you know, economically speaking, politically speaking, in my view, there is no proper grounding to persuade us, you know, to pursue the vice chair of Jubilee Party to pursue the path of benevolent dictatorship in Kenya. For heaven's sake, we are in the second decade of the 21st century,
yes,
where, among other things, information has become a critical tool for all of us. So whether you are here, whether you are in the heart of, you know, Harlem, information is flowing. Dictatorship thrives heavily where information is curtailed. That is not the case we have here.
Yes.
So that. Second thing, we have individuals who have become increasingly empowered the sense of empowerment, ranges from particularly economic empowerment, and that they're able to make choices at the marketplace. Now, we have a thriving liberal market system that is, again, inimical to what? The idea of benevolent dictatorship. So in my view, we do not need a benevolent dictatorship in this part of the world.
But looking at that particular editorial cartoon in the Standard today, what does it tell you?
Well, it speaks to, the question of very tempting times. Those of us who are focused on, possibilities of the idea, liberal democracy. Of course, there is the word, going around town that this is something we have received, and that liberal democracy is not, from this extraction, not from this part of the world. I think that's child's play. You look at the cartoon, we need to ask a question. Who is President Paul Kagame? Like Professor indicates, you look back, there is so much that, when you stand today, you can demonstrate who on earth this gentleman is. So several things have led to the situation, that we are looking at in Rwanda. Now, I think what is perhaps most important, in my view is, when you change rules of the game to be suitable to you as an individual, it means that the idea, the rule of law, if we are to, broaden the conversation and discuss political development, which is sustained change, of a period of time in societies. So this question of political development then has certain ingredients. You have perhaps the key three things: the set of state arrangement, you have the idea, the rule of law itself, then you have mechanisms of accountability. Now, if we pick the middle one, the rule of law, and then you have a situation where someone interested in contesting for political office is thrown under the bus,
yes,
together with the entire family. What are you telling us?
Okay. All right, let's come to you, Professor Kagwanja, because yes, we saw the general election that was in Rwanda, and he won 98.9%. In this epoch of time, is that plausible? Is that actually realistic? Because we had the envoy there, the British High Commissioner to Rwanda, stoutly denying that he won fairly. Right, and of course, also this drew a lot of flack from, the authorities in Rwanda as well.
First and foremost, let me dispel some misnomers here.
Misnomers.
Yeah. First, there's nothing like benevolent dictatorship. It's a word that we've coined to justify some irregularities and illegalities in our systems. I mean, how can you be a dictator and at the same time be benevolent? We really need to be questioning some of these concepts. You are either ruling according to the rule of law, or you are ruling according to other criteria other than the rule of law. And therefore, benevolence doesn't come in. When the moment you begin to hear that language of benevolent this, benevolent that, then you have to begin questioning the philosophical foundation of that kind of thinking. What it means, in short, is that you are drifting from an institution-based mode of governance to individualized, personalized modes of governance. And to reach a stage where you have, Plato's philosopher king, who is very intellectualized, well endowed with knowledge, charismatic, and all. Then they leave office. What do you do when you get a buffoon at the top of leadership? So the security of the people does not depend on the individual. It depends on the strength of the institutions that you have established for yourselves. And therefore, the moment you begin to hear these concepts like benevolent dictator, this and that, know that we are going now towards personalized rule. And for most of us, we begin feeling very uncomfortable, because it means, let's take, for example, we live in this country and we're born and brought up in this country. President Jomo Kenyatta was enlightened, was charismatic, and so on. He ruled in the same constitution, and Western scholars, we were not of age those days, so we didn't define concept. They were defined largely for us. They called him they call his government accountable authoritarianism.
Accountable authoritarianism.
Authoritarianism. That's how Joel Bakan, one of the prominent scholars of the West, very well known and an expert on Kenya, described Mzee Kenyatta's government as accountable authoritarianism. And it was given a clean bill of health as a thriving market democracy and so on. Nobody paid attention to the constitutionality of that government. Because we were looking to a benevolent leader, an endowed, charismatic, God-sent leader to us because of the charisma and so on. We forgot the Constitution. Then we came back to the same, and we started talking about 24 years of dictatorship under the same Constitution. Then came in Kibaki with the same Constitution, and we started talking about a good leader. Now, those ebbs and tides of leadership occurred because we did not pay attention to the institutional foundations of a thing, and we started talking about personality. My argument is that I'm not going to get into the debate of personalities. I want to get into the debate of the quality of the institutions, our respect for the institutions, our respect for the rule of law.
All right.
That's really where I'm
But we cannot truly uncouple when we're talking about institutions and personalities, because personalities are using also institutions to actually also pander to their own whims as well. That's why I want you to respond to that particular editorial cartoon and tell us if I've asked you a very pressing, or not really pressing, but a very pointed question. Do you think in this epoch of time we can actually have a leader winning 98.9% victory in election?
That's why I'm asking, the point I'm looking at that, I don't want to look at Kagame. The philosophical basis of Rwanda's governance is totally different from the philosophical basis of our own governance.
Fantastic.
In Rwanda,
yes,
the argument is development and national unity in post-genocide Rwanda are prime. And therefore, they are struggling to define that order. And 98%, I wouldn't even go to 98, even 80% of a vote anywhere in the world that is that you got 80 is suspect. And I would have expected Kagame to be wiser in terms of how you deal with things. Anything above 80 is suspect, because we are talking about choices of the people. In that country, there are mad people who don't need the accurate reason, and they will vote the opposite side because they did not get a bread in the morning. So you expect, a margin of error that is reasonable. When you start seeing figures of 98, or you start seeing those curious figures, then that's not right. So yes, it means that you need to begin to look at the institutions that produce this kind of results. Are they democratic?
Fantastic.
Even before you look at the leader.
All right, thank you. And of course, we will drill deeper into that. Let's hear from Dr. Cesar Mwangi.
Yeah, Debarl, I'd just like to touch on that point. We have somebody who is being called a dictator in Rwanda, a benevolent dictator, and he gets 98% of the vote. The suggestion, therefore, is that he's democratically elected, right? That's what we're saying. So it's okay. Simplistically, we can say it is okay. People love him. But now, let's go back 2,500 years ago. At the time of Socrates, Socrates said he has a problem with democracy. Because every single person has a vote, yes. But the problem is, giving every single person a vote is like telling anybody to take a ship through a storm, and yet he's not a trained sailor, or she's not a trained sailor. It is dangerous. And I think therein lies the challenge we have with democracy without the enabling education, the enabling capacity of people to discern what they want, what they need, and what is right. And in fact, Socrates was very clear. He said, people are rational beings, but at times they are pushed to irrationality by their own leaders. Okay? Where their issues are raised and fear is put into them, and therefore they start becoming irrational. Yet they are rational beings who have the capacity to be rational and should be deep thinkers. And I think herein lies the problem. So let us be very clear. Democracy as we see it, as we practice it currently, even in Rwanda or even in Kenya or even in the UK or the US, is a pseudo-democracy. from Socrates' definition, and I agree with it, unfortunately, because it makes sense that if you're to choose the cause of your governance or the cause of your leaders, the choice of your leaders, you must have the capacity to do it rationally. And I think that therein lies the problem. And yes, Rwanda is a classic case of this particular problem. And as much as people may complain, democracy is flawed as we practice it. And I think that is where people take advantage now, and then they start taking other steps where they say, so long as people have voted for me, who are you to oppose me? And I suspect that cartoon is talking about that now, okay? Which is common. We saw it in this country in the 80s, where the opposition was demonized.
Right.
Because I am a popular leader. And that popularity, by the way, is judged on the number of votes you get, however those votes are reached, whether through irrational voters or through manipulation. That is the challenge we have.
All right, let's say from Martin Law.
All right on this, Okatun. I mean, I think there are many issues that are coming up. And Caesar does raise an interesting thing. Caesar, several years later, Henry Gibson writes a play, and he calls it An Enemy of the People.
Right.
And he has a character there called Dr. Stockman, who really has problems with democracy. and I think the thing about democracy is that I think we have romanticized the term, and we've made democracy look like a perfect thing. And let's get it right, that actually democracy has given us Trump in the US. Yes. I'm not sure that Trump is a great leader, but democracy has given us Trump. Democracy has given us Brexit. A very rational decision, but it is there. And there are three things that I look at when I think about democracy in Africa. I call it a trinity of issues. I mean, the trinity of traditions. You see, the way we look at our leaders is influenced with our traditional concept of a leader. And so in our leaders, we see chiefs, we see essentially authoritarian persons. We are not necessarily looking for democrats in this case. And then the second issue is that we then use constitutions and use laws to then validate our concept of a leader. So once we have given this chief of ours this role, we try and give him a law and try to think that he can rule through the law. Now, the problem with it is that we immediately see the traditional leader beginning to claw back progressive aspects of the law because it doesn't cohere with his traditional role of a chief, a fellow who is not supposed to be questioned, a fellow who is above everybody else. He's the man among men, he's a power unto himself, and that's the Kagame, that he's tall, yes, but this time he's a bit huge, though he's not in terms of size, but generally everything else is shadowed by his towering height. And then, of course, there is the ego trip. Every African leader, or rather the problem with African leadership is the big ego trip. That they are the best thing that has ever happened to Africa, and they are the last good thing that will ever happen to Africa. It's no wonder that Museveni thinks that at 70-something, he must change the constitution in order for him not to be bad at 75, because there is no any other better person in Uganda. Same to Kagame, and so on. So basically what we are dealing with here is, let us deconstruct the term democracy, and let's look at how it's actually being abused and misused. Because when you go for a 98% election vote or election victory, what are you trying to do? You're trying to say that you have been democratically elected, that actually close to 100 people, 100% have endorsed you. If you look at this, the concept in East Africa is a challenge. If you look at South Sudan, it's supposed to be a democratic republic of South Sudan. If you look at Uganda, it's Democratic Republic of Uganda, and Kenya is democratic, and so on. Indeed, if you look at our political parties, almost every other political party has democratic something in it. Now, for me, the usage of the word and the practice are at variance.
So are we having a misnomer when we're talking about democracy? Because it seems that the far that we want to, get a hidebound definition of democracy, it seems it's very elusive to us. That it is very, very like a holy grail. When we seem to be actually reaching at democracy, it seems also to elude us. So it's like a mirage which can never be fully realized. What is democracy? Maybe we should just get back to the brass tacks and identify what truly is democracy, George.
First of all, I made a mistake. I ought to have acknowledged and thanked my teacher here. Thank you for teaching me. He taught me at Kenya School of Law, and I passed his exam. And without him, I would not be sitting here. Thank you, Martin Olo.
When the teacher meets the student.
Yes. Therefore, I'm going to be very careful with what I say, because I might go outside the boundary and say things that are not actually within the concept of his teaching. And I'm also equally very happy with my newfound friends here for their academic enrichment. I'm also learning from you. Now, if you come to the word democracy, if you look at the English Oxford Dictionary and the Longman, the English version, the Oxford Dictionary, and the Longman version, the American dictionary, I think you'll find that the words, though going towards the same meaning, they will not be the same. Now, if you look at the words of the famous Fela Kuti in Nigeria,
yes,
Fela Kuti defined democracy as crazy demo. He just actually cut the words into demo, crazy, democracy, and then he started with crazy demo. So the word is crazy demonstrations. And then if you look at the infamous case of Arizona versus there's a case in Arizona which actually gave the president in what we call evidence adduced as a result of misconduct, even though the evidence would be ready and good to prosecute, but the procedure in which it was actually adduced is suspect. And they coined the word, the fruits of a poisonous tree, in which case I want to use the same hypo in defining democracy. Democracy, in a way, is like a tree with fruits from a tree that is poisoned, the fruits from a poisonous tree, whereby if you eat, you either become sour or you actually get the gist of it for temporary time, and once it gets into you, once you suck you suck the sweetness of the fruit before it becomes sour as a result of the poisonous tree, then it actually embeds itself into your mental technology. It becomes actually initiated into your system, and then you become poisonous yourself, in which case, benevolent dictator, and I would stick by that, even though my senior here, two seniors, tried to run away from it and tried to say that it doesn't matter how. But let me put it very individually in my own personal opinion. We cannot look at the whole concept and say, this is a democracy. Yes, it could be a democracy, but which route did you use to arrive at that? And that's why you see dictators, and I'm calling him a benevolent dictator, because he has killed almost every opponent for him to remain poisonous, for the fruits to come, or for the fruits to actually have their own venom from the poisonous tree. A person who kills, or a person who uses legislation to actually confer himself an authoritative regalia, like what Pandit Nehru did in 1951, when he actually coerced MPs to pass legislation like what we are seeing here at the moment in this country. The Supreme Court shut it down because that legislation was coming from a tree, from a poisonous tree, or a fruit of a poisonous tree. So there's no logic conclusion, there's no logic wording, or there's no accepted definition of democracy. And I think it depends on how you define it.
So it depends on how you define it. There's no hidebound or ironclad definition of the word democracy. We shall also be looking and listening from other panelists. We want to take a short break right now. When we circle back, of course, we'll continue with our panelists and we drill deeper into that, looking at how democracy also is panning out in East Africa as well, and Africa as a whole as well. You're watching Leadership Forum here on AM Live, running on Decision 2017. We take a short break. Don't go away, much more coming up on the other side of the break. Right, I'm holding court this morning with Martin Olo, who is an advocate of the High Court. Also, we do have with us Professor George Wajakoya, who is a lecturer at University of Nairobi, advocate at George and Linden. Also, we do have with us Peter Kagwanja, who is Professor Peter Kagwanja is the Chief Executive of Africa Policy Institute, visiting a scholar, Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies, University of Nairobi, and also a former government advisor to the President Mwai Kibaki, 2008 to 2013. We have Dr. Caesar Mwangi, who is a leader of Center for Leadership, and we do have also a visiting lecturer at the Strathmore University, and also we have Maurice Mashiwa. He is the CEO of Serrano Consultancy. Thank you for continuing with this discussion. We were actually looking at and defining democracy, and we were to circle back with you, Professor Peter Kagwanja.
Yeah, before you even define anything and elevate it to that level of that prestige, we must distinguish two things. Is it an end in itself, or is it a means to an end? Democracy is a means to an end. Nations define what their ends are. In Kenya, if you go by our national anthem, one of the primary things that we're looking for is justice. The other we are looking for is prosperity. And you can go on with the ends. At no point is democracy mentioned in our national anthem, because it's one of the many things that we're going to use. And we have chosen, and globally, there is no one democracy. Forget about the definitions, dictionary or otherwise. It is the ideology that the people have chosen for themselves that defines the nature of that democracy. What do I mean? China is having its own 68th communal celebration of the nation, and in that gathering of the Communist Party of China, they will be talking about our democracy. You will have questions about the use of our democracy by the Chinese, because you have already a preconceived idea that the Chinese cannot be democratic because they have a communist party. That's one. Here, we have chosen a specific form of democracy we call liberal democracy. And now what we are finding now is that the international, the liberal world order is collapsing. And the democracy everywhere is in crisis. There is nobody to call any shots. I mean, for example, do you think that Trump would begin lecturing Kagame on how to be democratic? And I think that's the point Martin was trying to make. Now, do you think that Prime Minister May in UK, after Brexit, can come and lecture anybody in Africa about democracy? So in other words, the core that held democracy, liberal democracy, I'm defining liberal democracy, is basically losing the hold. It's losing the grip. And I think in Kenya, coming home just to be relevant to the Kenyans, we are paying the price of having the pendulum of liberal democracy moving too far to the extreme. That's why people are calling for benevolent dictatorship, because somehow you're beginning to fall rules and systems that are not really aligning themselves to the ends that Kenyans want to be their ends. For example, we would want a situation where when you're making a decision about whether to overturn or not to overturn a constitution, you spell out very clearly the norms, the traditions, and the values that are going to do that. Not about the illegalities, irregularities, and administrative errors. And that's what the problems are. If the Supreme Court came out clearly and said the norm of this was violated, the value of this, our tradition in regard to this, and that's why Professor Jackton Ojwang made more sense to this republic than anybody else. He made sense not because he was right, but he clearly tried to demonstrate the values and the traditions and the institutions that he used to base his own argument. It might be right, it might be wrong, but the truth of the matter is that he made the effort. So in other words, let's not talk about democracy good or bad. The issue we are debating is not democracy. These are two words that we confuse: liberalism and democracy.
All right, let's not really get into the jargon of liberalism, and then we lose our viewers on what truly the main issues are. Because I think when we try and define democracy and liberalism, we'll just get into the market. Yes,
it is simple. Liberalism, put simple, is the dictatorship of the market. The market dictates. The market defines. Fantastic. And everything's defined.
All right, let's not be very academic, but we want to see what is really happening currently also, as we've started with Rwanda. Paul Kagame now, we have the insurrection, or maybe not really the insurrection, but we have Diana Rwigara, who she's been charged with insurrection. Her family, the mother Adeline and her sister Anne as well, they've been put to the slumbers. If we just begin from there, And we're talking about personality and also institutions as well, where we can see leaders using institutions. And this is what the hallmark maybe of a modern democracy is. It's not really the brute force that we saw earlier, where you're using, you know, the military and you're using, you know, your power to actually suppress people who are opposing you, but you're using institutions as well. What would we say? We begin with Rwanda, we go to Uganda, we also go to Burundi, what is happening in Tanzania itself, and we come back home as well. Let's continue with Dr. Caesars very briefly.
Yeah. In fact, we've got several examples now where we are saying democracy is being violated. But let us be very objective. Democracy cannot exist without a set of democratic values. Yeah. I think we need to be very clear that we cannot talk about democracy without talking about the democratic values. And those values are very straightforward. One of them is freedom, for example. Another one is equality, accountability, fairness, openness, transparency, and trust. Those are 7 which I've picked, right? Now, those are democratic values which in any so-called democratic society, they should be prevailing as part of all the decision-making going on at all institutional levels. But the second thing, in all those countries, there are personalities involved, right? There is Museveni in Uganda, there is Kagame in Rwanda, and there is our leaders here in this country. And those leaders also have got personal values.
Yes.
And they should be aspiring for us to exercise, to say we are ruling benevolently or in a democratic way. There are certain values that are also involved, which are also related to democracy. And one of those is caring, honesty, authenticity, and compassion, for example. Now, those are the issues that cause problems, because there is democracy as a word which is being used, which is supposed to have certain good values, and then we see certain bad values in the individuals involved. And that tension now causes the chaos that we see and the fighting. I mean, it's incredible to see people fighting in parliament, the way we've seen those Ugandan honorable members of parliament fighting. And I think that is where the wheels have fallen off the bus. And we need to go back and now rethink. And the only way to rethink is to say, let us have democratic values which are acceptable, and then personalities who embrace personal values which are consistent with those democratic values.
Thank you. Having said that, tone for the conversation as well, and knowing what democracy is, let's drill deeper and trying to see what are the hallmarks of a modern dictator. If he's not using the brute force, then what is he using? Let's hear from you, Mashewa.
Thank you very much. Nicomachean Ethics is a book written by Aristotle. It speaks to several things. The introduction in that book simply, you know, points to something which I consider important, and you know, I'd like to introduce it here. That wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, but it's for the sake of something else. So, the hallmarks of modern day dictator. Now, if we rephrase Aristotle's idea on, you know, from Nicomachean Ethics, we'll perhaps, you know, say that democracy is not the good in itself that we are seeking. So let us look at what are the various instrumental role, you know, pointers we can pick from democratic environment. Up front, you have something we would call protective security, social safety nets in a society. See that? We have transparency guarantees. We have such things as political freedom. Now, very important, and this is why dictatorship, you know, begins to take root in society, something we would call economic facilities. Then you have social opportunities. Now, what is the making of a modern day dictator? Is this chap who, because for the period they have been in office, they have not been able to pursue these ideals, these instrumental, you know, game changers in a democratic environment. What do? They simply say, we can use the law, an easy avenue, because they are very charismatic, they sway society, they have the numbers in parliament, so that is an easier option. Now, is the idea dictatorship in itself tenable this time and age? Now, Prof here talked about the question institutions. If you look at Douglas North, you know, did excellent work. No wonder was given Nobel Prize in 1993. We have a set of institutional arrangements that make it possible for societies to evolve over time. Now, this evolution has been chalked, or is being chalked today, which is why people are feeling that, wait a minute, Because ordinary people in society, you know, like quinine, democracy is not delivering for their malaria. So that, like quinine at the marketplace, if you happen at the market and you don't have money, you will still sleep hungry, yet you are at the marketplace. So the idea, dictatorship is taking hold in some people's, you know, minds, because what they naturally expect from it is not being delivered at the table. So what are we to do about it? So the push, the tag, what we are experiencing in itself is good. It is very good. Look at South Africa. ANC has evolved over 104 years. See that? As of the time they were, you know, dethroning the apartheid system, they were, you know, somewhere 80-something years. See that? So societies take very long to emerge.
Thank you.
If you pick Trump country before Martin, you know, picks it, Trump would run America, you know, out of town. But because of the set of institutional arrangements you have in that country, it's not going to run America dry.
All right.
Yes.
Okay.
I was going to answer very straight. And the making of a modern day a dictator looks like this. Number one, he has a party, he or she has a party. And that party could be NRM, that party could be ODM, that party could be SPLM. And they hold on to that party in such a manner that any dissent in that party earns you an expulsion. Or you create another splinter, and what you want to do is to create another splinter that looks like it, SPLM Mageuzi or SCCM Mageuzi. So you are looking for a piece of this thing because it's the piece that is making a dictatorship thrive. The second, they hold the tribes at ransom. So they use the tribe to trade. So that with the tribe and the party normally has, there's a guy who has written a very interesting article about Kisumu and so on in the Star. So once you've held your tribe, then you now begin to work on institutions. I mean, look at any of our leaders, and that's why you realize that potentially we just have dictators. Look at the hold of, the hold on to political parties, Wiper, or ODM, or Ford Kenya, or Jubilee. Mention any of them. The hold on it, the grip on it is so tough that the primaries alone will show you that here, it's either my way or the highway. So you must draw a certain line in order for you to get that ticket. So that is something that becomes, so institutions begin to be captive, and then you use the numbers. For example, you go to parliament, realize that you can use parliament to give you, to insulate you, you go there. And then of course, as you were saying earlier, if an institution is not working for you, you choke it, or you starve it of funding and so on. So there are certain indicators that you can see that drive us where we are. And so Museveni's best is keep on changing the constitution to fit your circumstance every time you want to take a corner.
Right. Let's hear from Professor.
Yes, I think I have to put a footnote as usual. You ought to have warned me that this was going to be an academic discussion. But I'm directly going to...
You're turning it to be an academic discussion. Yeah, we'll drill deeper into, of course,
yes,
we have to know the background.
Not a bad thing. But I'm going to address the common man on the street, that person who doesn't actually understand the academic jargon, the scientific version of definitions. And I also don't want to use the court language, or the language you use in court, which is synonymous to the jurisprudence of legal paralysis, as we may refer to it. Now, agreeing with what my friends have said in one way or the other, and I'm not disagreeing, because we have to digest different versions so that we can also learn from each other, not actually being very autocratic, like I've seen most of the panelists fighting over nothing because of, yeah. Now, my teacher, he has made it very, very clear, and I will go by his line of thinking, and I'm not going to repeat what he has said, but I'm just going to add value. And one of the things that I'm going to speak about is what I did yesterday when I was addressing Parliament on behalf of the political parties liaison committee, a committee of 67 parties, which includes ODM and Jubilee, that came up and said no, the rule to the mutilation of the Constitution as per the current discussion of the act that is going actually to mutilate the Constitution, the act that is very selective, selecting one commission over others, which is actually discrimination, the act that is actually being whipped by the whims, the whims of those whose background and conduct and current position in Parliament is suspect, given the fact that we are still waiting for the decisions to be made in court and to see whether some of those are going to come back in Parliament. Now, one of the key words is insecurity. Insecurity. Modern dictatorship, or modern democracy, as it is called, and I will say there is no word like modern dictatorship. There is either dictatorship in anarchy or dictatorship in periphery. One of the key words is insecurity. One uses the word democracy to get into power. And once he reaches or gets into power, he closes himself with a wall. Diane, who is now being incarcerated in Rwanda, her father was once a very close friend of Paul Kagame. He was actually one of those people that was financing Paul Kagame, but he was killed in devious circumstances, and nobody wants to think of that. Now, if you find out that there is a pile of behavior, or a system of behavior, or a custom of behavior from a political leader with the utterances you have had there, with those that you have shown us, then you ask yourself 3 questions. What is this institution that one is trying to annihilate? When the president comes up and says, our Kora, what does that show the nation? Even if they say that this is, it is nice, it's political. This is a leader, he's the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church in the Vatican, telling off priests who have been found in an insecure way with the nuns, then saying it is okay. Now, if Babu Owino can take a leaf from what the leaders are uttering out there, and also utter something, is he not learning from what has been said from the top there? Secondly, the issue of coercion and corruption. Modern dictatorship brings in coercion, corruption becomes the rule of the day, and the entrenchment of the whims of insubordination, just like Martin Olo has said, and also Professor Dr. Caesar, whereby insecurity comes in, but for you to entrench that insecurity, you must go into the institution and annihilate those institutions, financial institution, corruption, the security forces of the country, insubordination of the courts, like we are seeing what is happening here, where a few men, 200 and something men, and they now want to annihilate, manipulate, and give us law that we cannot swallow. Remember, Oginga Odinga was the vice president, and he came up with a bill in Parliament, a bill which was aimed at taming up those who were opponents of the government at that particular time. But he was the first recipient of detention. And his son came in for 2 terms of 4 years each. So when a benevolent dictator or benevolent dictatorship comes up with the whims and fruits of a poisonous tree, as I said before, then who is the sufferer? Nani masufferers here? These are the very, very individuals that we are trying to address now in whichever term and language of expression that we are using in this podium. Finally, let's look at the economic manipulation. Economic manipulation. Economic is good. Economics is good. It's good for the country. If now we can have a benevolent dictator who can actually bring economic propensities and emancipation, like what happened in Singapore, which borrowed from Kenya in 1965, which actually borrowed the blueprint of Nairobi City and then became or translated into itself from benevolent dictatorship into anarchical dictatorship, into an economic dictatorship. It was for the good of those who wanted to have economic emancipation in one way, and for the bad of those who wanted to make things go right, like what is happening in Rwanda and what is happening in Kenya today. And I rest my case there.
Thank you. Let's just hear from Professor Kagwanja, because we want to go back. I think that particular cartoon of Gado really epitomizes maybe what we could be talking about the modern dictator. Though you say there's no really modern dictator, but the modern dictator, as you may realize what we're saying, maybe they use the institutions because they cannot use really the brute force. If we may just put it up so that we can see. Because first of all, they muzzle the media. And that is what we can observe as well, if we have that particular cartoon. And then they muzzle the international community as well. I think then they muzzle the opposition and they muzzle the civil society. We can actually even bring it back home. Looking at all this that has been happening, how fair have we been to maybe give us an assessment for the even current regime in terms of giving the liberties for the media as well? We have had the Information Act that was enforced was very contentious before, about journalists, the way they could be jailed and put into the slumbers for so many years because of their stories, so to speak. We've had also the security bills before. So in light of that, because there's a book by, I think, William J. Dobson. He says that today's dictators understand that in a globalized world, the more brutal forms of intimidation, mass arrests, firing squad, and violent crackdowns are best replaced with more subtle forms of coercion. Rather than forcibly arrest members of a human rights group, today's most effective despots deploy tax collectors or health inspectors to shut down dissident groups. Laws are written broadly, then used like a scalpel to target the groups the government deems threats. And he goes on, today dictators also pepper their speeches with references to liberty, justice, and the rule of law. And on he goes on also to just mention in this particular book. In light of this, what can we say?
Now, first and foremost, and I want to add my voice to Professor Wajakoya's view that dictatorship is neither modern or new or old. They bring about the notion about new dictatorship, modern dictatorship. That's propagandistic, and I think we need to expand it from our public debate. Because dictatorships are as old as the hills. What is new are the forms we have devised to deal with it. Human instinct is basically to dominate. Because by our very nature, we are animals. And in all animal community, if you watch all these world features, there must be that dominant male and that matriarch. That's the nature of humanity. Therefore, we have been working to tame those primitive instincts and begin to rule ourselves in a more decent way. Now, there can be dictatorships from different things, and Kenya is going through those motions. And let's not miss the point. We started off with the dictatorship of the executive, and we felt the pain of it, where the executive is so powerful, what we were then calling imperial presidency, and we dealt with that. Then we moved to the dictatorship of parliament. You saw appointments by executive thrown out, and the president going to the media to complain about appointees that he has made and cannot be ratified by parliament. Parliament going and giving itself salaries that you've never heard. Parliament deciding who does this and that. That was the tyranny of the legislature, another tyranny. Now, what we are going through now is the tyranny of the court, the judiciary, in a very muted way, because other institutions are still functional. So we are having this dialogue of institutions, which to me is very healthy. It would be wrong for Kenyans to myopically begin to see this as an emerging authoritarianism. Because until you undermine the fundamentals of democracy, then you can begin to talk about dictatorship and so on. I don't see President Kenyatta being able to be a dictator under this constitution. He would have to suspend it.
You'll have to suspend it.
So I think the best way, the best set of mind to look at this thing in terms of dictatorship in the region, because we've taken a regional perspective, is basically to talk about the pains of dictatorship and the pains of democracy. You use Kenya as a typical case of where you have excessive democracy, and in this case that you are still held in the old systems.
Thank you.
Now, why that is important to look at is, if we are moving from a process where we talked about norms, traditions, and systems in terms of judging things, and therefore you, in constitutions, in amendments, or in law, you did not give serious attention to processes. Let me tell you one thing, Inea, and your audience will be watching. One of the greatest risks to this democracy as we speak now is if one Chairman Chebukati is struck by lightning on the 26th of October. That will throw this country into a serious crisis. Why? We never thought about the consequences of a chairman who has no deputy and where the deputy cannot take over immediately
Thank you.
and execute the job.
Right. He mentioned the tyranny of the judiciary, Dr. Caesar.
Yes.
And maybe he can actually try. When we talk about the tyranny of judiciary, what do we really mean? Because this is a word also has been, bandied about since now the ruling, the tyranny of the judiciary.
One thing I love about this country is our ability to play around with words that evoke certain images. Tyranny of numbers, tyranny of the judiciary. Next we'll have tyranny of the media.
Tyranny of the majority.
Tyranny of the yeah. But anyway.
Tyranny of the panelists.
You see, I think this word tyranny, if you look at democracy, we're talking about power, where people have the power, ruled by the people. And tyranny comes in when people are overlooked and their well-being and the greater good of the people is overlooked. And decisions are taken for whatever reason. They may be legal, they may be very well thought through, but in the big picture, they seem to be negating the aspirations of the people. I'll just give you a simple example. In this country today, 99.99% of the people in this country, all they want to do, as we speak, when they wake up today, is to earn a living honestly, and put bread on the table for their families, send their children to school, and live in a peaceful environment. Yeah. That is the aspiration of the majority of the people of this country, right? But when decisions are taken where this legitimate and genuine aspiration of an ordinary person is not taken into consideration, then there's an element of tyranny. And I think in the judicial process that took place and the decisions that were taken, I suspect that is where the word tyranny came in. And I think if we have a very specific referendum right now to ordinary mwananchi in this country, they will say we need to get to a level where we can take care of ourselves and live in peace. We do not want to fight, we do not want to argue, we don't want to haggle. And I think that is where the tyranny of the judiciary is coming, in my view.
All right. Let's come to the courts. This is where the court is. We have Professor Ojokoya and Martin Olo. Tyranny of numbers, tyranny actually of the judiciary. This coming from Professor Kagwanja. What will you also weigh in when you're talking about the tyranny of the judiciary?
You know,
you're misleading us.
Again, tonight, with a lot of...
let's concentrate on, yes,
what
yes,
I've
Martin,
heard from both Professor Kagwanja and my friend Caesar. The issue about the Supreme Court should be read in terms of the Constitution. Look at it from Article 10, Article 3. Then look at the principles of elections, the principles set out in elections, 81, 82, 83. Now, when you apply those principles, it is not how you look at the norms and how you look at the values. It's how you look at the fidelity to the principles, whether by that law, the elections law, or by the practice of IBC. So that when you come down to what the Supreme Court eventually pronounces itself to, it also depends on where you're sitting. And this is the problem we have when we're looking at even issues of tyranny and so on. If you're sitting on the side that feels the four were right, you have everything good that you want to say. Or if you are on the side of the two, you have everything that you want to say. However, the very nature of a Supreme Court world over is such that numbers determine. So the majority decision holds sway. It matters not how persuasive the dissenting opinion is or dissenting judgment is, it is not law. And that's what the practice of law is about. So in this particular case, yes, it's 4 against 2. And if you looked at the good old man, the senior counsel Norridge's closing statement, or rather parting statement, that's what it is. That, you know, it's what you're brought before the court, and it's what is backed with the law and case and the various precedences that holds. I mean, and courts do not necessarily drive themselves or push themselves into the issues. They simply adjudicate upon the issues that have been brought before them. Now, for us, we have said in the Constitution, there are actually, whenever a Kenyan has a complaint to make about presidential elections, we've said that Kenyan can go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can also invalidate. So we've said that in our constitution. So once we have it in our constitution, again, we go by it. If we don't like it, we look for ways in which we change it. But we've said that we will, that an election can be invalidated. Not because it was not voted by the people. Obviously, it's an election of the people. And having expressed themselves, that is what is subject to.
May I interject a little bit on that? Just a quick point. By talking about the tyranny or the authoritarianism of the court, whether it's the Supreme Court, particularly tyranny in regard to judiciary can only come from the Supreme Court, not other courts, because other courts you can question them through the processes of appeal. It's only the Supreme Court. And I would want you to go to the American Supreme Court, which has existed for the 250 years. And this is where the words tyranny of the judiciary is used. That's where that vocabulary, it is in the US. In 2000, the Americans said that their democracy has been diluted because the dictatorship of the Supreme Court has privileged the numbers of the judges other than the numbers of the votes. So it is the judiciary versus the people. And that's where you begin to talk about dictatorship. Because lack of dictatorship is when there is collective dictatorship of the people.
Let's hear from George.
The power of the people.
For the first time, I'm going to agree with my two, and it seems as if we are proponents in our ideas, but that's healthy. For the first time, I'm going to agree with you on two fronts. Number one, the Supreme Court sometimes can be used, or the highest court in the land sometimes can be used to actually create dictatorship. If you look in the case of Scott, Ted Scott, and I hope you've known about the slavery in the United States, where the courts validated that slavery was a good thing, and that buying and selling of African Americans was a good thing. And that case actually lived in the books for a very, very long time until the First Amendment rights, the First Amendment on fundamental freedoms came in. And number two, if you split and look at the other side of the coin, you also come to Justice Marshall's pronouncements in the Board of Education case on segregation, where the courts again, the same courts again came up and said that segregation was bad. Now, if you move to South Africa during the apartheid regime, you'll find out that the tyranny of numbers in the courts also validated apartheid. Therefore, if Kenyans are talking of that side, we also have to look outside and see what the courts have done in other jurisdictions. Now, coming in and now coming to my teacher's side, of which I'll make a point. Yes, when there's a minority decision, does it mean that decision is bad? When there's a dissenting opinion, does it mean that dissenting opinion cannot be adapted to overturn the majority decision, or adapted by Parliament to give the guidelines through new legislation? What if you look at the treaty? A country has ascended to a treaty. Another one has ascended to that treaty through protocol. Of course, we are looking at Article 2.5 and 2.6 of the Constitution here. And we come and borrow a leaf from Botswana, where there was no law on inheritance and succession of women inheriting property. What did the courts do? They applied the tyranny of numbers to adapt the protocol, the international treaty through protocol, where they said that women also had rights to inherit property, and that became law. Now, how do we insensitize the dissenting opinion? Who is actually given the custodian of democracy in a country? That is the president, in accordance with this constitution. All right. Now, where the president now comes up to mutilate his own validation by now siding with the minority and saying that is the law, even though it's a political opinion like any other person, then that actually causes eyebrows, and I rest there.
All right. Okay. I want just to also draw, because when we're talking about, and you say we shouldn't use also the modern dictator because the dictator, but the forms of dictatorship that we do have, using the institutions. I raised them as well. In light of that, and where we're coming from and as a history of this country, how have we fared? And compared to what other regimes are doing around East Africa. We know of Uganda as well. We know of Tanzania, what is happening with the civil society as well. How can we compare this, Martin?
You see, what basically we are saying is that we have a trend across. Fortunately or unfortunately, we have a club called the East African Community, in which club now a few additions have come in. I mean, we have Rwanda come in, we have Burundi come in, and recently we've had South Sudan come in. Regardless of whether South Sudan had actually met the thresholds that could have allowed it to be admitted. Now, you have a big brother in the neighborhood called Museveni. And then you have our latest entrant on the scene called Magufuli. The styles are something else. I mean, he is making decisions on the streets. He is not giving people any due process. He makes pronouncements, and then, you know, either people are sacked or people are fired. Now, certainly there is something that is now becoming common. So when you look at the tyranny of numbers, then you'll see that the majority of the leaders in the East African community are now those who are tending towards being authoritarian, very disrespectful of their opponents, and are more likely than not to stick to power a little longer than it can be. So when you see the case of Uganda trying to change the law, what makes it not possible for Kenyans to think about it? What makes it not possible for even Uganda to think about it? Of course, for Kagame, again, there is an opportunity for him there. So basically what we're looking at in East Africa is that we might want to look at the reasons that led to the collapse of the East African community in 1977. But the reasons that may lead to even the cementing of the East African community in the coming days, if leaders seem to be agreed about how to run their countries and how not to respect the people's spaces and so on. Again, as Professor Kagwanja was saying, the unfortunate thing for us, or the fortunate thing for us in Kenya, is that our constitution is so progressive that for anybody in Kenya to think about emulating Rwanda or emulating Uganda, it becomes very difficult for them. Because Article 10, the preamble, the sovereignty arguments, the institutional arrangements, the institutional separation of powers, and so on. I mean, how many times have you heard the president saying, look, my hands are held, I can't do this, I can't do that. And that's a good thing, because our leaders ought to feel sometimes helpless in order for democracy to grow, in order for people's space to grow.
All right, let's cross over to Uganda with the age limit debate as well, and what has been happening in Parliament. What really comes to mind? Because this has been also the same trend in Rwanda. We know they also changed the constitution to push, you know, the presidential term of Kagame to 2034. If I'm right, I could be wrong, I stand to be corrected. And of course, this is happening now in Uganda as well, pushing the age limit. So we see they take now the instruments of, you know, the constitution, which is one of them, to actually try and tweak and maybe widen their scope and have a room to swing their cards the way they want to. So how can we as a country, because we are the people, we are the majority, try and tame this, and we have these powerful forces over us using the constitution to suppress us? Let's say from Cesar Mwangi. That will come to.
Okay. The constitution is the supreme law. And world over, laws have been misused for certain specific ends, right? And we always say that for a society to be run properly, or to have order, we need laws. But some of those laws, if they are put in place and passed for certain objectives that are not for the common good, then they are not good laws. But the lawyers will tell us those are the laws. In fact, this is the problem we have with law, because they are faulty laws. South Africa had laws of apartheid, but they were laws of the country. And people had to follow them, and people were arrested for not following them. Yet they were unjust laws. So I go back to the point about the values. The laws have got to have specific values. And if those values are not in place, then there's a problem. I'll just give you a simple example. Okay? You can pass a law to demonize the media, or to restrict the media in reporting certain things. And it's going to be illegal to report certain things. But you are now restricting the value of transparency in society. You understand? So it is not a good law. And that is when we say now dictatorship is creeping in. Because laws are being passed legally, yes, and people are being arrested for flouting those laws, yet those laws themselves are not based on a sound value, which is good for the common good. And I think that those are the discordant issues in society we need to be addressing. And that comes back down to saying if we want what is good for society, then we should try and pass laws that are good for society, not good for individuals. And the challenge with democracy is that democracy is trying to pass power to the people, but often it is hijacked by the ruling elite and other substantial elites in society. And that is where the problem is. And therefore, laws are passed to take care of those ruling elites or business elites or other substantial elites. In some countries, even religious elites. Right. And that is the problem that we have.
Let's say from Maurice.
I totally agree with him. Perhaps to add something more, this is the case of Uganda. And this is, epitomized across the road, in Rwanda, as well in Burundi. It is a question of narrowing down the range of choices available for people to make, such that we are held hostage to the idea mighty Museveni is our only savior. So that brings you to the critical question we asked at the start of this conversation. What is the purpose of leadership? When you come to office, Museveni, if I remember, was a tiny baby in 1986. When he came to office, he promised that he would do something by, his period of 10 years. He kept changing, he kept twisting, he kept going through metanoia. Same thing we are seeing in DR Congo. So question is, in Uganda, the people of Uganda are being treated to a situation where they cannot contemplate of possible alternatives past 2021 that Museveni says, no, I'm still around. Without me, Uganda is kaput. Without me, your security is kaput. Why on earth does he imagine without him, Uganda will be dead? We have to ask that question and look at each other in the crystal ball and then figure out what is it we need to do. Now, if you look widely within East Africa, within Africa, we have the Agenda 2063. It picks out 8 key areas of focus. One of them is democratic governance. So the African Union, we also have the East African, Vision 2050. So these sets of visions, our visionaries outlined in our constitution, it is so puritanical. It is so holy. Yet you have several, grails in it. The grails are on the practice. What is the practice? What is it we are doing to realize those objectives? So the African Union will tell you that by 2063, Africa will be, a significant player with global positioning. What are we doing to realize that? Social and economic development. Where do you realize that? It is widening the set of arrangements where people can make a variety of choices. Are we seeing that in Uganda? If the clip we saw is anything to go by, MPs are being run out of town because they're holding alternative views. So what does it speak to the state of democracy in this part of the world? There are those who have an outright pessimistic view. In my view, societies have to go down the trenches that way and then evolve. In this country, we saw, what happened to Timothy Njoya's and group. So we have struggled to come to where we are. So a chap my age, my level, we are celebrating what our elders have achieved.
Right.
What is my role? It is to be an active agent of sustaining that transformation we have realized.
Right. Let's say from Professor, he raises the issue of the Messiah syndrome, that I'm the savior. You cannot do without me. I'm the cog in the wheel who is holding all these spokes, and the wheel is turning and is turning. And this is happening also in Uganda, in Rwanda, where people they esteem President Kagame so highly, and he's also perpetrated that notion that he's a savior.
I think a politician must be allowed to be who they are. And the moment you start to dictate the kind of politician you want, then you're trying to have a common measure. That's why in society, we aggregate. For example, we have the clergy. These are people we expect to behave in certain decorums, etiquettes, and norms. We move from there, we have business people. We expect them to behave in a certain way. We have lawyers and other professionals who we expect to behave in a certain way. Politicians are the warriors of the land. And many times they learn amok. Their best hope is to have ultimate power. So the instinct of a politician is to be a dictator, benevolent or otherwise. Hitler went to power through an overwhelming political victory in a democratic process. He never imposed himself on the Germans. But once in power, and the respect and the fear and adoration he heard from the Germans, he transformed himself into the Messiah and transformed his country into anarchy and through the world into chaos. Now, what I'm trying to say in short is that the Messiah syndrome is instinct within politicians. Our role as members of society is to get that power and put it to the people. And that is what we have done as Kenyans. We have put the power, the ultimate power, on the sovereign. And we have defined the sovereign as the people of Kenya. That's it. And as long as we can guard that, that the sovereign will always remain the people, not the Messiah, then we are okay. Right. But let me tell you, let me quickly talk about the misnomers in this debate, very briefly. Age limit, that is dictatorship. Because a wise man can be very young, and a wise man can be old. So any constitution that tries to equate democracy with a certain age is dictatorial. It is another form of apartheid where you say a certain people of the certain color and pigmentation are the best to rule and others are not. 2, the term limit is dictatorial. And I want to say that openly. It is actually the odd, not the norm. Why do I say so? We have just enthroned in Germany a leader who has been enthroned for the 4th time. Angela Merkel is the Chancellor of Germany for the 4th time. And she was not limited to the Chancellor of Germany for the 5th time. Until 1940s, Roosevelt ruled America for 4 terms and died in office. Now, so the age limit and the term limit are decided upon by a society depending on this history. Right. If you think,
Prof, let me interject if you allow me. But you see, Germany and Burundi are 2 diametrically opposed cases.
In our view.
In practice, America, for example, why did they then pass the constitution to have term limits? See that? So there is a unique set of wisdom that informs the question why term limits are good. Debarl, it is because when these folks come to office, and power is sweet, we have been told. See that? You suddenly realize you're above the law, so you cannot take the president to court. See that? And that staying there until you drop dead perhaps is the best option. So the practice, the way African leaders have treated being in office, have treated, their subjects, is what perhaps makes the question term limits.
And I want to add to this. I wish that Professor Kagwanja had stayed with what we started in terms of norms and values.
Yes.
Yeah. If you have this, the age limit or the term limit, what are the norms and values that are guiding you towards that end? But just a minute. Go ahead, because I have heard what you've said, but we want you to hear the other one. That's about the norms. If the intention of changing the term limit is so that the same person continues, then it's violating the norms and the values. Okay. If the intention of term limit is so that the person that is in power can die inside, then you have a Mugabe scenario. Yeah. So I hear where you're coming from, but the practice is the problem. And that, yes, when you look at Germany, when you look at even the UK doesn't have term limits. But the system has such a mechanism that Tony Blair comes and blairs his way around until he runs out of power, runs out of ideas, and he goes. Yes. Margaret Thatcher comes and yes, she's elected, but again she runs out of, and people just take them out. the values.
Let me wind up very quickly on that. That one.
Can we give Professor Wajakoya a moment also to wind up, because now we are actually having time. Is really not on our side to also give our closing remarks very briefly.
Thank you very much.
Very briefly.
Very quickly, I agree with Professor Kagwanja on age limit. That is unconstitutional. We have seen grey hairs in the House of Lords. We have seen grey hairs in Italy. We have seen grey hairs in gubernatorial positions in the United States. And you have seen wisdom in grey hair. So when somebody comes up and limits the term by age, that one is unconstitutional, save for Ugandan situation where it's being done too late.
Thank you.
Number two, thank you.
Thank you. Very briefly. Dr. Caesar.
Yes, in closing,
very briefly,
I just want to say, unfortunately, democracy does not work very well in situations where the people are not sufficiently educated. Civic education needs to be entrenched from primary school level all the way to university throughout, to start educating the citizens of this country what democracy is about and the responsibility they have in the election of their leaders.
Thank you. Yeah. Professor Kagwanja.
I think
very briefly,
in terms of judging the quality of democracy, we must distinguish between what are universal values and norms aligning to democracy and what are traditions of countries. In Kenya, for example, our tradition is to have 2 terms of 5 years each. And therefore, that becomes a tradition. It is not a norm.
Thank you.
And it's good.
Morris.
For me, the most pressing challenge that democracy faces is not for the member of parliament. It is to make democracy work for ordinary people. That is the most enduring challenge we face. And if we can do better to support mechanisms that can make that possible, the fight, media, all these stakeholders, it is a good experience we are going through.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Martin Law, very briefly.
I want to agree with what Caesar is saying, that the quality of democracy will be enhanced by the people who hold their leaders to account and who elect. As long as our people are looking for kings, they'll get kings. As long as our people have no parameters, we'll get the governors that we have, and so on. So even when we say that, well, after 5 years we kick them out, we kick out 75%, and we bring in another bunch that are not different from the others. So that's what our challenge is about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, and I just want to read one of the tweets that we have here from Baluwoi, and you say democracy being, we the people, and it says that democracy mean the bludgeoning of the people, by the people, and for the people. And this is by Oscar Wilde, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. So democracy means the bludgeoning of the people, by the people, and for the people. And of course, we use the people for demonstrations. We use the people, and as you say, it's very key that the people also be educated so that now we can also have a mature democracy. If there is anything like mature democracy, maybe Professor also may oppose that. Do we have a mature democracy or not? But I really want to appreciate your input this morning. Of course, this is a very robust discussion we've had, but it's nonetheless not really exhaustive, because I know this particular topic, we cannot really exhaust it. But I want to thank you also for your cogent input this morning, and of course also for sharing your views on democracy. Thank you very much as well for your valued company as well, and sharing your morning. Democracy, what is it? Is there anything like benevolent democracy? As our panelists have said, no, there's nothing like benevolent democracy, and there's no modern democracy. Democracy is democracy. So do you go by Oscar Wilde's also definition of democracy, which is bludgeoning of the people, by the people, for the people? Well, food for thought. Thank you. My name is Debarl Inea.